So again, welcome everyone. And Asha, one more time, it won't be my last time. I want to thank you for coming, and the Kriya gurus are happy. Just think about that for a moment. I know I'm anthropomorphizing God, but just think about it. We make God happy. And I think the gurus are happy that these two different streams flowing from the one source, Yogananda, come together. And we really felt this the first night, Vicki and I did, just the deep simpatico between us. So again, it's been a pleasure to have you. So you ready for my questions?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So if God is omnipotent and all-powerful, can he create a rock big enough that he can't lift? That's a joke.
You're not really asking me that.
No.
I shall maintain a dignified silence.
So the first question is based on the conversation we had, I think, the first night or the second night you were at our house. And you talked about, and I just like this word, the word that you used, how to integrate, and I'll say it 2 or 3 ways, how to integrate, that the goal is to integrate our mind with the mind of God, our heart with the heart of God. St. Paul in the New Testament said, "No longer I that lives, but Christ that lives in me." And one of the ways I like to talk about the avatars is that they are P.O. boxes for divinity. And so my question is, how do we nurture that oneness, that unity? And we are one always, but how do we tap into that consciousness so that, in essence, we have the thoughts of God and the gurus, and we have the heart of God and the gurus?
Is that really the only question you're going to ask me? Do you really want me to talk for 2 hours on that one question? Or
Go wherever
you
this.
must be teasing me. I'll just answer a little and then you'll ask me another one? Or
No, I'm really not teasing you.
Okay.
Don't worry, I'll fill in.
It was very interesting. I'll answer you seriously now that we've joked. Let me think how to say this. To a certain extent, Swami Kriyananda's consciousness was always the same. Literally, from the first time I saw him when he walked in the room when I was 22, his distance was about from here to the back wall. And he just walked in, and I felt that he was everywhere. And I was as far away from him as I could be in that arena. That was a big tent. But when he started talking, I felt like he was there. He was just talking to me. And his energy went way past me, and I couldn't, it had no edge to it. It was just completely unexpected, out of no context for that experience. And it led to everything else. But he never presented himself like that. There was no accoutrements of being the leader of the ashram, anything like it. It was very, very natural. He wore Hawaiian sport shirts and Bermuda shorts all summer, and when he would walk into a room, there was no ceremony. Hi, Swami, and you just go back to whatever you were doing. But I always felt that there was something of an entirely different order of magnitude. In 2010, which would have been 40 years later, I had a conversation with him. He died in spring of 2013. I said, "Swamiji, people often ask me if you have changed." And I said, I felt, and I explained to him what I just said, which he knew, that your consciousness from the moment I met you until now has been exactly the same. I said, the way you present yourself has changed enormously. I said, you had I felt, this was a question. You had so much work to do, and also we were too dopey to have really, we would have assumed a kind of artificial relationship with you if you had let it play out that way. But I feel like your consciousness has always been the same. Now, I had the responsibility from him of writing about him, which is the big book that's out there on the table, the one that takes 2 hands to lift. That's the one. And which is available in an audio book and a Kindle, which is a lot less of a physical challenge. But anyway, I knew I had to write that. I hadn't written it yet. And so he allowed me to clarify things. So first I said, is that true? And the second part of that question is, may I say that? Because there were other things that were true that at different times he didn't want me to say. So he said, yes, you can say that because it is true, which is really quite a statement given everything. So given that, nonetheless, he unfolded things somewhat slowly, and there seemed to be some actual change in his awareness of things, either his articulation or another piece of it, which was at one point he described the actual reality was another well-known teacher in America at that time came to visit and then asked Swami a question, kind of like a younger brother asking an older brother. And he said, sometimes my devotees, my disciples, he probably called them because it was a guru, he had a guru role. My disciples will have dreams about me in which they will have real experiences with me, but I'm not at all aware of that. Actually, I'm going to tell you a funny story in between. Swamiji and I were talking in a different context, and he said sometimes, he was commenting that sometimes people have dreams about him in which he gives them exactly the advice he would want to give them. And I said, do they listen to you, sir? And then I said, only in your dreams. But in any case, so he was talking to this man, and they talked a little back and forth. Just to finish it, because I asked Swami a similar question at a different point. He said, the superconscious never sleeps. The brain will go to sleep. Think about that. The superconscious is non-physical. It doesn't need to sleep. The brain sleeps, but your consciousness is not asleep. He didn't answer this man exactly that way, but that was the same answer, which is you will do things that your conscious mind doesn't know, but you're still doing them. Very interesting. But then in that context, Swamiji said, just kind of like another way of saying it, that spiritual advancement is simply that what your superconscious has always been aware of, your conscious mind becomes aware of, and basically the realities integrate. Nothing new is created, you just become aware. There you are again. So in that context, in it would have been 1990, Swami wrote a book he called The Essence of Self-Realization. His autobiography wrote about his life with Master. At that time, there was nothing written about Yogananda. Published in 1976. It was the first time a disciple had really written about Master. So it was really, for all of us, thrilling. It wasn't until 1990, 14 years later, that he wrote the second book about Master, The Essence of Self-Realization. There was a snowstorm, and the power went out. And Swami had all these notes, and that book is subject-oriented, so he tried to make a whole story of every important thing Master said about many different subjects. And he had some notes, but he didn't always have enough notes from the time he was with Master to fill in the pages. So he had to meditate and remember. And because the power went out, he couldn't use his computer. He had to just sit with a pencil or a pen. And he talked about how he would either remember or he would actually hear Master talking to him. He would either have a memory of what Master said or Master was speaking to him. And it was so intimate. He said sometimes he would say, excuse me, sir, I didn't get that word. or please talk a little more slowly. And he just sat on the couch of the house there and wrote that book that way. And after that experience, for whatever that actually meant to him, he said, my thoughts, he used the word thoughts first, my thoughts are so much Master's thoughts that I cannot tell where he starts, where he ends, and where I start and where I end. Because we are simply, our realities are the same reality. A little later, he expanded on that, and he simply said, I cannot tell where my consciousness begins and ends, and where Master's consciousness begins and ends. Now, I want to tie this just a little bit to, in bearing in mind, this is the similarity between the ant and the mountain lion, but there is some, because we all breathe, we're somewhat the same. That, of course, to all of us was just, breathtaking. That's just exactly what you want. You want your limited consciousness to become one with the infinite consciousness, or the student becomes the same as the teacher. But Swami asked me to write about him when I was 24, which was the first year I was with him. And after that, I always had a notebook and a pen in my hand. And for a couple of years, I even had a tape recorder, but after a while, I gave that up. Over 45 years. And I being conscientious, but unsystematic. I had, the notebooks were large and small, and pencil and pen, and sometimes they were afterwards on the typewriter, and so I ended up with just boxes of scraps of paper, which it took me 1.5 years to organize, and I finally got them all organized. I wrote the Light Bearer book, which has a lot in it, but there's a huge amount that's not in there, which is what I'm going to do as soon as I go home. I've started writing it. I'm going to finish. So I'm going through 45 years of my own life, because I've worked through a lot of this, just looking at those notes. And to come to all of this, I'm looking at my own mind. And some of these notes, there's a little scribbled July 1971, a little thing like that. And I've been given a very clear memory for things related to him, but I don't remember it. But I read that, and it's my thought. That's how it feels to me. And I looked and I thought, this is who I am. And there was never any dramatic, superconscious, kind of transference of anything. And, people sometimes ask me for the most memorable experiences, and I don't have many, just like nothing really out of the ordinary happens to me. Nothing woo-woo hardly ever happens to me. It just doesn't. But somehow or another, my reality has gradually shifted from all the ideas that I made up myself to the ideas that I've integrated because I wanted to. Because I wanted to, in the sense that I wanted to be happy. And this was divine law that I was learning. And so at a certain point, this just becomes natural. It's not like any of this is foreign to us. Just like we grow into our adult bodies, and little children, there's some children's song all about the day that I could finally reach far enough to turn on the faucet and wash my own hands. Mommy, will I ever be able to turn on the faucet? And Mommy promises that someday you will be able to. And I suspect that all of us just walk up to the faucet and turn it on now. We don't have that sense of thrill that we can turn on the faucet, because when you're a child, the growth of your body just happens. And we're just children. We're children in relation to the masters. And if we just, if we really want to be different. And so I think it's mean, there's many different ways that you could say, how do we integrate, which is the word that you were using. And I honestly think that the single key is if you want to. And if you want to take the gift that Divine Mother is giving you more than you want to grip onto the one that you already have. You know, because they want to give us this gift. That's the main point. It's like it takes a tremendous amount of energy to remain egoically separated from the divine. There used to be some cartoon that I remember from my childhood where there was some kind of a character who had the concept of a diving bell. Does that ring any, just like it's a submarine, but somehow it's a tiny little cartoon submarine. And it goes down in the water, but if you're in a submarine, the ocean is determined to break through that shell. And you have to work so hard, the shell does, to hold the ocean out. That's actually what our reality is. We have to work so hard to remain separate and deluded. and everything in creation is trying to wake us up. And grace flows in if we give an opening to grace. And it just has to be a conscientious, consistent desire. And the more you back it up with an open mind and an open heart, the more the ocean comes in and the shell goes away. And it's a heart and mind story. I mean, some people talk about it being only a heart, but it's also a mind story, because we make up the truth. And do we want to continue to live with the one that we made up? Or are we interested in the inescapability of divine law? And I'll add one more point to that then. When Swami was in charge of the monks at SRF, he developed this course in discipleship, and he had, I believe, the 5 attitudes of a disciple or something like that. It was very well done. The first quality of a disciple is courage, really, even before devotion, because it's the courage of the unknown, and it's just the adventure, the trust. It takes courage to trust, and it takes courage to be honest enough to accept your limitations and then learn something new. And I think that's perhaps an answer to it.
That's a great answer, and I'm going to pull 2 things out of what you said and then have you comment. One is the last thing you said, courage. And I'll maybe put this in a context for people maybe who have had trauma in their lives. Trusting can be difficult. Letting go can be difficult. And so the courage that you had to drop, and I'm sure it was a process, but to drop the walls, to drop the defenses, to drop the rationalizations, and make yourself, for lack of a better word, vulnerable to Kriyananda. That's the first observation. The second observation is we have a notion a lot of times of devotion that it's emotion. Mm-hmm. And there certainly can be a feeling of devotion. But what you did to me is the essence of devotion. You, in different ways, you listened to him, you made yourself available to him, you wrote what he said down. And I think what happened over a period of time where he ends and you begin is a blurred line. And
Yeah.
I know you're very humble, but what you just modeled for us is devotion, what true devotion is. attentiveness to the guru, attentiveness to the truth that they teach, and attentiveness vis-a-vis service of the guru.
Yeah.
I remember, some of you know Father Richard Rory is a Franciscan priest. He's been a spiritual father figure to me. And many, many years ago, he just said to me, whose thoughts do you prefer, yours or Jesus's?
Yeah, that's right. That's right, exactly.
I knew what the right answer is. I wanted to argue, but I knew what the right answer was. But it wasn't just having some sort of cognitive understanding. It is allowing I call it the Christ impulse,
Fair enough.
to invade me
Exactly.
with my permission.
Exactly.
But I want to say how you modeled devotion and service. So another question is, having gotten to know you, how much you live service. In fact, your whole life is service. And I'll just, something I shared with you, and then I want you to talk about service, is I'll be 70 at the end of this year. And my fantasy was always, by the time I'm 70, I'll be spending 6 to 8 hours a day in meditation. Vicki will be bringing me my food. I would come out.
In your dreams.
Precisely. And I would come out, and when we were with our grandchildren, I would be a loving grandchildren, show up once in a while on a Thursday night and give a spellbinding talk. And darn it, I am busier than I have ever been
Yeah.
in my whole life. And paradoxically, 98% of the time, it's a joy.
Yeah,
So can you talk about service maybe in terms of this attunement and this integration?
very good. Somewhere in one of his books, it might be in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, Swami has a very simple sentence. Selfless service is the fastest and most effective way to overcome the ego. He doesn't even say Kriya Yoga, which is very interesting. I mentioned somewhere at the beginning of my talking to you all, maybe it was on Thursday, that when I read Vivekananda's statement, don't think about yourself and be happy, I was 18 years old, and my first thought was, what else is there to think about? I mean, really, it was just like an incomprehensible thought. I've never been selfish. I have always had a generous spirit, but I have been aware of myself, until I conscientiously tried to stop. But the way I finally put it to myself is I was always calculating my own advantage, but not selfishly. I was always looking to maximize the fun. So I was always aware of where it fit in so that I could make it more fun. In other words, I was always at the center of my universe. And when I read that and I realized it was important, I literally just I remember talking out loud, literally describing the environment around me. Oh, there's telephone poles. Oh, there's a gas station. Just in order to just think about something other than me. It was really impressive how constant self-concern was. That's the word I finally came to. And then I went to move to the Ananda village, and I was up at the meditation retreat, and he put me in the kitchen, asked me to help in the kitchen. About 3 weeks after that, the actual real manager had some family emergency and drove off in the middle of the night and never came back. So all of a sudden, I'm the manager. We're cooking for guests and for residents. It's about 30 people for every meal, because there were no separate kitchens at that point. I cooked 3 meals a day, 6 days a week. And on the 7th day, I got into the big pickup truck. I took 20 loads of laundry into town because we didn't have washing machines. I did everybody's laundry. I bought all the supplies, and then I drove the truck back. And when the weather was bad and it was snowing, we could only get halfway up the hill, and then we'd have to schlep all the stuff up. It was so much fun. I absolutely loved it. And I was so busy. And my only helper, God bless her, and I don't mean this in an unkind way, but something had happened to her brain when she was young. So she had a very good heart, but not an entirely functioning brain. And so she helped me, and then I did this. Let's just say I was busy. I loved every minute of it. And for the first time in my life, I was totally focused on something that just obliterated me. And I literally remember someone coming up to me and saying, "How are you?" And I was startled. Who? Really, like I went, who? Me? Oh, me. And that was the first time I realized that if I could just become a flow of energy, then you become the energy. And if you don't ask yourself if you're happy, you're generally happy. You have to stop and wonder if you're happy. Do you understand what I mean? If you just are in the flow of life. And everybody has a temperament, and my temperament is I work better when the energy's flowing through. And it's not like I become morose or something like that, but far from ever imagining that I would ever sit there for 6 or 8 hours and meditate every day and that would actually be my life. I just knew not in this incarnation. You know, it's just some of us are born for something else. And the other half of that, at least in my own, is I have a debt to pay. I just like, there have been so many blessings in this life that I have to pour it out. And I don't know how to pour it out just through meditation. But I do know how to pour it out this way. Just as a small joke on that one. You know, every so often you have the opportunity to have some psychic tell you who you used to be and so on like that. Swami actually told me, it's something to do with my hands and my horoscope. It might be my hand. The way those two fingers lean together. He gave me some esoteric explanation that was articulate in defense of Dharma. He said to me, if I ever misused the gift, I would lose it. Just like that, it would be gone. And the psychic said I helped start the French Revolution.
Why doesn't that surprise us?
There was a woman, actually, who was critical in starting it and then became horrified as to what it developed. I mean, I sort of read a little about her. I thought it could be. I didn't recognize it. But the point is, I used the gift to persuade people of lesser realities and sometimes even dangerous realities. So I have a debt to pay. It crossed my mind that someday I might stop talking, which was really a remarkable thought, that at some point it could balance. But until then, I must keep the energy going. But it's not tapasya. It's like, what a joy.
Yeah.
Just have and when all else fails, I just go in the kitchen and cook for people.
Yes.
As long as it can just keep going. Yeah.
Well, let me quote, I think, something from St. Clare of Assisi. She was Francis's sidekick, and every bit his equal. And she uses the word love, but I think it's interchangeable with service. Mm-hmm. She said, you become what you love.
The channel is blessed by that which flows through it. That's how Yogananda put it. Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
So let me bring up another piece with that, and again, have you comment. I made the statement a few minutes ago that particularly if we've had trauma in our life,
that's right.
It makes it difficult to let go sometimes. And I'll just share a real breakthrough moment of my life. Some of you in the Assisi Institute have heard this, but it ties in also to what you were saying about karma today. Again, Richard Rohr, this Franciscan priest, he was, I was like 35 at the time, and he was in town. Those of you that went to Sinbad's for lunch today, we were driving in my car very close to Sinbad's. Mm-hmm. And he turned to me, and I had a very difficult childhood. My mother died when I was 12. My father was an alcoholic. I was homeless. I was put into a home for juvenile delinquents. I quit school in the 8th grade, yada, yada, yada. And it was during the mid-'80s or the early '90s, and I was in therapy every week trying to heal my inner child and give myself the childhood I never had. And there was a reality to that, but you could also get stuck in that. Anyway, so that's the background. So we're driving in the car, and he turned to me and he said, it's really a good thing you had the childhood that you had. Hmm. And I turned to him, I said, Richard, I'm in therapy every week reparenting my child. And he said, I know you had a very difficult childhood. He said, but you're very gifted. And he said, if you weren't wounded, you'd just be a yuppie making lots of money and contributing nothing to the world. Wow. He said, you've become a wounded healer. And this was the last line that was the beginning of an evolution, a revolution in my thinking. He said, maybe that was the childhood that you were supposed to have. And suddenly a light bulb went off. It didn't mean that I stopped my therapy necessarily, but I stopped being a victim. And there was something in that realization that allowed my heart to open a little bit more, to be open in the way that you were open with Kriyananda.
Interesting. You know, that's the answer to the question you asked, Anne-Marie, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, it's so obvious, in a sense. It's obvious after it's obvious.
Yes.
Yeah. That you would not become great if you weren't compelled to put out the energy to become great. So would you have a soft ride in a mediocre life? Or are you under pressure? What is it? The diamond is under a great deal of pressure, and that makes it a diamond. I mean, they're not empty words. They really are the truth of the matter when we can see it and feel it. You know, I wasn't always open to Swami because I was too dumb, but I wanted to be. And you know, use the word devoted, devotion. We use the word devotion, and generally we mean Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, Rama Rama. You know, that's what we think of when we say devotion. But of course, the origin of the word devotion is devoted, and you can be. So I think devotion is about what you're devoted to, and so I was devoted to freedom. I was devoted to wisdom and joy of the 8 manifestations. Someone asked me that question once. I'd never thought of it. What are your favorite manifestations of God? Someone said to me. I thought, what a dopey, fabulous question, you know? And I realized that I have 2, and one is joy and one is wisdom. And they're sort of equal. You know, the concept of truth seeker is there. So what you're devoted to is really determines also what you become. Because I was devoted to truth, and I was devoted to understanding where happiness came from and how to avoid suffering. I said to Swami early on, "Sir, as long as I can remember, I've been determined to find happiness, and I've never been unhappy." I said, "This is a little weird, isn't it?" And he said, "Past lives, obvious. Plenty of suffering in past lives. Doesn't mean you have to still suffer, but you know what you're trying to avoid." So this is what I was saying, where you have to get your mind engaged too. If you're only just going by your feelings, unless your feelings are already extraordinarily purified, your feelings can mislead you unless you also have some principles in front of you. And the principle of what is true, what is really lastingly true. And I did some remarkably obtuse things, considering how determined I was. To this extent. At a certain point, Swami Kriyananda decided that some of his books would sell better if he sold them under his American name of Donald Walters. Because in some context, Swami Kriyananda was an obstacle rather than an asset to getting people interested. His book on education, on art, on money, or a few of them, leadership. For reasons that are obscure to me now, I really thought that was a bad idea. Well, actually, they're not obscure to me. I thought it was a bad idea. That's all there is. I had no authority. I was not involved in the publishing by that point. But that's just how I felt, and it was clear that's how I felt. 20 years later, Swamiji was visiting us, and I really do not know how it came up. But he said, I would have used Donald Walters as my author's name, a long time ago, but Asha thwarted me. That's the word he used. Thwarted me? And I was like, what? I was just like, I had no idea. I knew I had my opinion, but I had no idea the sensitivity with which he related to my ignorance to preserve my confidence and my self-respect. That's the only way I can think to say it. And then, as he saw that I didn't react except to, with like, wow, I never knew that. In fact, he said rather casually, you often thwarted me. Yeah, That's what he said. You often thwarted me. So overnight, I came back downstairs. He was in our house. And the next morning, and I said, I believe I owe you a global apology. And he said, yes. I said, consider it given. But what that was is, it's more subtle, the whole thing, because what you think you're doing and what you're actually doing are not always the same. But my intention never wavered. Even when I was unable to fulfill it, and many years earlier when I did other things that were not as good as they could have been, he quoted Master, God reads the heart. And I didn't quite know what he meant by that. And he said, you can't always fulfill what your intention is. And sometimes you act with good intention, but without sufficient wisdom for the result to be what you want it to be. But he said that the divine looks at who you are inside and then works with that. So don't think that once you just make up your mind that it's a done deal, because we have so many levels, we have so many vrittis within us that are contradicting our ideals. So, but the most important thing is to constantly revisit your first premises and reaffirm your first premises. Because if that's there, I call it, it's like you plant radioactivity seeds in your heart, and they'll just gradually mutate the whole system if you just leave them in there and just keep, not what I'm doing, but what I aspire to do. One last thought on that. Swamiji said once, he said, if you're going to judge yourself, and then parenthetically he said, which I don't recommend, he said, by the time any action has been accomplished, he said, it's already behind you. Because nothing is static in this world, it's a flow of energy. So if you're going to judge yourself at all, judge yourself by your aspiration. Because what you aspire to become is where your energy is going. And where you are is already history. And that's a real comfort. Here's one of the ways I play with that. Realization is infinite. Delusion is finite. Therefore, even if you have 100 million errors to make, every time you make one, you take one off the tally. And eternity will outlast even 100 million errors. So every time you make an error, you have one less that you have to do. Because if you aspire for freedom, it will be fulfilled. Okay?
So again, staying in this flow, picking up on something you said, that my translation is, you made some mistakes along the way.
Oh, that's a very generous way to say it, yeah.
But essentially your heart was in the right place.
Always.
And so, again, I didn't come tonight planning on quoting Richard Rohr a lot, but one of the things he said to me many years ago, and I'm going to then tie it into something Jesus said, and you can see this in Yogananda's life. He said, God can live with honest mistakes. He said, where's it written, thou shalt not make a mistake? And then he said, if you're not willing to take a risk to make a mistake,
Courage.
God can't do anything with you.
Exactly.
And there's a line by Jesus, it sounds harsh, but if you interpret it in this way, he said, I'd rather have you be hot or cold, but if you're lukewarm, I will spew you from my mouth.
Exactly.
Because if you're hot or cold, you're giving God some Velcro to work with. Okay? So again, I don't know if you want to say some more about that, but the willingness to take a risk, and we're going to make mistakes, we're going to make wrong decisions, but again, God sees the purity of our intentions, and that's what saves the day.
Well, the way I've heard it in the same comments exactly, from a different angle, is simply, it's better. Spiritual progress requires energy, and that's why Yogananda put such emphasis on the energization exercises. I was saying to a smaller group earlier, everything that Master taught, he re-articulated it in ways that were consistent with his time and place. The avatars all teach the same thing, is that they all have the same state of consciousness, they all have a state of absolute freedom. But once they incarnate, they become restricted by the needs of their disciples, the culture in which they've entered, and the particular mission that they're carrying out. So when Jesus talked about wineskins and sheaves of wheat and sheep that have fallen into the ditch on the Sabbath and whether you should pull them out or not, he was not trying to be obscure, you know? I mean, he asked me if my sheep fell into the ditch on the Sabbath, would I pull it out? And I think, I don't know, I don't have any sheep. You know, in fact, I've only ever been close to a sheep once. And there's no ditches where I live. You know, just like, it's all becomes very obscure. But it isn't. He was really trying to just make it exactly what it was. He also talked about kings and servants and masters, because in the world that he lived in, there were lots of kings and servants and masters. Yogananda talks a little about that, but he talks about television and movies and radio and airplanes and submarines. And there'll be a time when those will be obscure references. But everything he taught was classic. It was exactly what Jesus taught, exactly what Krishna taught, exactly what Buddha taught, but from the angle that this particular place needed. But he had one original contribution, and that is the energization exercises. No one ever had those before. Yoga postures have always existed. Everything, Kriya itself has always existed. But not the energization, because he wanted us fundamentally to understand that spiritual life is the quality and quantity and the direction of your energy. And that's really what we're working with. So if you don't have any energy flowing, it does not necessarily mean that you have transcended anything. It just means that there's not enough light through the window to see what the pattern on the window is. There's a very apocryphal, probably, story about Swami Vivekananda when he was in the United States, and some man came up to him and said, Swami, I would like, help me to realize God. And the Swami said back to him, can you lie? Oh, I would never tell a lie. He said, well, you must learn to lie so convincingly that no one will know that you're lying. Can you steal? Oh, no, Swami, I would never steal. You must become so good at stealing that you never get caught. And he said, when you master both of those skills, come back and ask me about God. The explanation of that is twofold. First of all, there was nothing for Swami Vivekananda to work with. There was just nothing happening. And the other was, he also felt that this man was not pious. He was just too lazy to sin. But if he had any energy, that's where it would go. So he said, just get moving, and then we'll work with it. And so that was why, Swami and Master, they always preferred a racehorse to a dull nag. Yeah, because at least the horse is in motion. Right. It could be running the wrong direction, but all you have to do is redirect it. You don't have to just get it out of the stall. It's already moving. So Swami was like that.
All right, so let me move it into this context, because I think it's implied, and I'll do a little advertising. I have a book that we were going to publish it in May, but we're going to wait till September 1st. And it's called The Hero's Journey through the template of the life of Francis of Assisi. But this is the point, is that a good life, a noble life, a holy life, spiritual life, a life worth living, it's an adventure. And now, a little confession, it ties into thinking that I would be meditating 8 hours a day. That once upon a time, my goal in the spiritual life was to be in such a state of peaceful bliss that it would be okay for me just to sit on a park bench all day or whatever and do nothing. And then through a series of events, that's not my path. And there's no real transformation in that path. That where the transformation comes is the willingness to embrace the adventure and to take risk and to extend energy and even be willing to fail in the process. But it's an adventure. And rather than looking for safe ground, to always be moving towards the high ground. I don't know if you want to talk about spirituality and the path as adventure.
Well, that's how Swami, why courage was the first thing that has to happen. Courage and energy. And, it's interesting. Let me think about this for a minute. I'm trying to think what the courage part of it is. To me, well, this was my karma. The horrible risk was that I wouldn't find something to devote myself to. I mean, like the real terrifying prospect to me. And I don't mean this unkindly to anybody in this room or anybody on the planet, but I was afraid I would marry a dentist. I have no idea why that was my particular fear. I don't know who in this room is a dentist, but I had this picture in my mind that my husband would be a dentist. And at that point I had, and in my dream, my not so happy dream, I drove one of those station wagons with the wood on the side. I had a bunch of kids in the car, and then in the far back there was a dog. This was my nightmare, honestly, that there would just be nothing out of the ordinary, unpredictable about my life. So my fear was backwards. My fear was that there would never be the opportunity to take a risk, rather than that taking the risk would be bad. But I also had a very serious element to that. About when I was 18 or 19, when I was just starting, I had this, I articulate it by saying I was awake all night. I don't know if I literally was, but it was that kind of a feeling. And at that point in my life, I didn't even know anybody who had ever died, what to speak of being in the presence of someone who died. Subsequently, I've sat there and been there when people breathe their last, or been there for the last days or weeks, more than once. So I know what that looks like. But apparently I knew it even before I knew it, because I had this visualization of my own death. And it wasn't morbid in itself. Somehow death has always seemed just like part of what we do when we come here. But the whole scene was exactly as I've seen it played out multiple times, how the person gradually withdraws from this world, becomes more and more gaunt, how the people around you are somewhere between very attentive and bored, waiting for you to die.
Or irritated.
Or irritated, and sometimes they're paying attention to you, and sometimes they forget, and they just talk about the sports or politics, over your dying body. And none of that was hurtful. That part wasn't the hurtful part. None of it was hurtful. The part was that I realized that no matter how many people loved me, and in my deathbed scene, a lot of people loved me, and so it was a lot of people who were involved. No matter how many loved me, no matter how deeply they loved me, no matter how wonderful our life had been together, when I died, it would just be me. Just be me and my consciousness. And I just did not want to have done nothing at that point. I didn't want to have just done all the expected things. And I could also feel so deeply in myself that I would not feel that my life had been worthwhile if I hadn't contributed in some way, if I hadn't found meaning and shared that meaning, just like that. And that was a tremendous motivator for me to find the path, because what I was terrified of was the lack of spiritual adventure, rather than the demands of it. And so even though the way you talk about it is common, and I actually also use those words too, but what are we really afraid of? I think mediocrity and meaninglessness is a much more terrifying prospect than having risked everything and only got third place out of the whole thing. Even I just want to add, in the Bhagavad Gita, which is the conversation between the disciple Arjuna and the Lord Krishna, I'm paraphrasing, but this is one of Arjuna's questions, one of the really important questions. Arjuna says, Krishna, if I follow your advice And I give up on all these worldly ambitions, and I don't do anything, and I have no pleasures, and all of these things are gone, and I don't realize God, I'll end up with nothing. I'll have missed out on life, and I won't have God, and it'll just be a big zero, which is a natural fear, isn't it? Maybe that's the biggest fear. That's when Krishna says back, Arjuna, my devotee is never lost. I am always with you. And then he says, whatever you have attained, you take with you in your next birth. And the more you have tried, the more privileged and more blessed that next birth will be. So why are we afraid? No effort is ever lost. Mhm.
So let me put this in a certain context. I think there might be a temptation for some people listening saying, well, gosh, I'm not a spiritual teacher. I'm not a leader in the Yogananda community. I'm not, a leader in the Assisi Institute. I have the circumstances of my life, and I use this word in quotation marks, are mundane. So how do I live the adventure, and how do I live it? And I'm going to paraphrase Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Are you familiar with him?
Oh, by name,
Okay.
not by teaching.
He was a monk in the Middle Ages, and he said there are 4 stages in the spiritual life. Not perfect, but it captures the essence of something. He said, first stage is we go to God because we want things. We want things. And then he said, we go to God because we're in pain and suffering and we want relief from suffering. And that brings us closer to God. And then he said, we get to the stage where we just love God for the sake of loving God. That's pretty high. But he said, then there's a final stage where all that we want to do is to be an instrument in the hands of God. And so we stop asking God what God can do for us, and we say, God, what can we do for you? And my point in terms of people who feel like their lives are more mundane, there really is nothing mundane. If we begin every day with the prayer, with the intention, with the aspiration to just be an instrument in any and all situations, that energy you talk about begins to flow through us. And it's people at the Assisi Institute have heard me say this. The people that you see in the grocery store, choose to love them. Smile at them. If you work for somebody, you're an employee, imagine that you're working for God. And your goal is to love your employer. Or if you're the boss, your goal is to love your underlings, to love your clients, to be that intentional every day. Creates that flow and begins to create the adventure. One of the things I've learned many things with being married to Vicky Jo. I like to say I talk the talk, but she walks it. She wakes up every day with a plan to love and to serve other people. It's just part of her nature. And living with her, I see that energy, that love just flowing through her. The house we lived in a number of years ago, there was a deer. A herd of deer would come through every morning, and there was one deer that had a broken leg, and it was just walking around on 3 legs, and it could tell it was struggling. Vicky brought a blanket outside and tried to give it a blanket and was going to take it into our house. Now, the deer was smart enough to say, no, thank you. But I have to think that simple aspiration to love one of God's creatures had made God smile. So I've learned from you, it's not always about doing great things in terms of the adventure. To paraphrase Mother Teresa, it's doing ordinary things with great love and always staying awake and just always asking, God, what can I do for you today in this circumstance, in this situation?
A friend of mine became a woman, very strong, very dynamic, very capable. She picked up some kind of parasites, and it took 7 years before she was recovered, during which that time she was just greatly debilitated and really did not know if she would ever recover. And this is her story, not mine, because I don't know if I could do what she did. But when she really thought she just might never get back to what she was, she made this little pact with God. She said, I had a lot of ideas about what I could do for you, but if none of it is ever possible, I'll just be one person on this planet who loves you. And really think about that. One person who loves God. There's a lot of power in that. It's a grave mistake to apply worldly measurement to understanding spirituality. It's like God does not care, really. I mean, you think about your life review. Have you heard any death and return experience when they come back and they say, oh, well, you made partner, and you're only 43 years old. Congratulations. You won the big case. You made the big deal. Like, who cares? How much did you love? And again, this is also, it's like we're each exactly where we're supposed to be, and nobody's position is better or worse because it's just theirs. You have to be where you have to be. And the other thing is, one of the laws of abundance is to maximize the blessings you do have. If you always are saying, oh, I would be better if, and I would really put out energy if, and I would really be good if, then you're basically squandering whatever opportunities you have. And if somebody squanders the gifts that are given and doesn't respect them, even in human life, you don't give them any more. But if you take whatever tiny portion of opportunity or talent or whatever it is given to you, and just absolutely use it to the max, then the laws of magnetism shower more and more upon you. So if you feel that you lack on any level, especially if you lack opportunity, just make the very best of what you have. And then to those, this is what Jesus says, to those who have, more shall be given. To those who have not, even the little they have will be taken away. And he's not really talking about outer riches, he's talking about inner attitude. So don't mistake the form for the essence. It's a grave mistake.
So I'm going to tell a little parable, and then I'd like you to comment on it. And then maybe we can move to questions with people.
Anything you want, sir, you're in charge.
I'm in charge?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But I want to put this parable in the context of all of you. If you're sitting here in this room, and it's not because of the room, it's because of the intention that brought you to this room, you have really good karma. If you're hungry for God, you have really good karma. And I'm going to make this statement, then I'm going to go to the parable. Every one of you is incredibly courageous. And let me put it in the context of this parable. And the parable, it's a parable, but it's telling a truth. Before God created planet Earth in this dimension, he called all of the souls together. Remember, the soul is eternal and immortal. And he said, I'm going to ask those of you who love me to do something. To take on a human form and a human body and go down to this place on planet Earth. 90% raised their hand. He said, wait a minute, there's more to it. He said, you're going to go down to planet Earth, and particularly if you live in the northern hemisphere, it's cold, it's hard, it's difficult, and life isn't going to be easy. How many of you love me enough to do it? 50% raised their hand. He said, well, don't raise your hand yet because there's more to it. You're going to go down there and you're going to forget about me for a period of time. and you're going to forget that you've forgotten about me. And they said, well, why would you ever ask us to do this? And he said, because I've never had the experience of forgetting, and I've never had the joy of waking up. And how many of me, how many of you love me enough to take that assignment? And there was one more question. Will you be with us even though we have forgotten? He said, I'll always be with you.
Yeah.
You were among the souls that said, we love you enough to take that assignment. And even if it takes 10,000 lifetimes to wake up, I love you enough to give you the experience and the joy of waking up. Don't doubt your love for God. And don't doubt your courageousness, or you wouldn't be here.
Swami said whenever he would see people suffering, this was one of the ways he dealt with people suffering. He would think, how much more joyous then will be the day when they realize God and are finally free. And that realization and awakening would be all the sweeter for the suffering that came before that drove them to it. All of that is poetic, but it's also true. Yeah, exactly. Very good.
So we'll take some time for questions, and I promised my good friend that he got the first question tonight.
I was at Sunburst for 4 years in my 20s. Like you, I got there when I was 22.
Mm-hmm.
And like you, I'm Jewish.
Uh-huh.
My question is, I've been on the path since I was 18, really. And I'm comfortable. I've been to India twice. I'm extremely comfortable with the Indian gurus. And as a Jew, I guess it is. I just have challenges in my relationship with Jesus.
Right. Okay. That's the question. The question was from as he introduced himself to me last night as my fellow, he said we're from the same tribe. Yeah. He was born into a Jewish family also. And his question is, what about Jesus? Because he and I both know, and many of whoever else in this room was raised that way, you can be anything and still be Jewish except have a relationship with Jesus. That's like the breaking point. You can be a Hindu, you can be a Buddhist, you can be just about anything, but Jesus is the line in the sand. So, but the interesting thing about Ananda itself and about the whole, whatever you would call it, the movement toward the Eastern religion, is that the proportion of Jews in it is much higher than the national average. Yeah, because Jews are always in the forefront of change. I mean, in every field, they just are. There's lots of reasons for it. I think there's an intellectuality. And also, I've thought about this a lot. In a certain way, Jews are always, even though in this country we've lived securely, there's always this thought that sooner or later you'll be ostracized or kicked out of the country. And so you always have to be ready to make your own life. You can't depend on the world around you. I'm talking to those of you who've talked to me about being Jewish. A friend of mine, very close friend, was talking to me about the fact that she has her grandmother's cut glass punch bowl. And the question is, who is going to inherit it from her? She's presenting this to me, and in a family that's going to be a real issue. My mind is, your family has held a glass object for all these generations. Didn't somebody come in and either steal it or smash it? It was just beyond me to think that you could live in such a stable way. And I've been perfectly comfortable. I've never in my life been discriminated against for being Jewish because I don't look Jewish. But whatever it is, so it's not anything in this life, but that knowledge of independence has a tremendous positive side. And that means that we're not ordinary thinkers, as a rule. We're really capable. So when some new movement comes along, we're often just right there in the middle. So the leadership of Ananda and the core of Ananda is, there's a lot of us. Diksha, who was from Israel, many of you know her now, she has been very prominent within Ananda for years. She, just to give the whole story, she borrowed a car from someone in some complicated situation when nothing was working out for her. She borrowed somebody's car to go to a job interview, and she was so nervous, there was a cassette in, she pushed the cassette, it was me. And I'm talking to her about something that she found extremely interesting, so she followed through to find out where I was. And at that time, we had a very small storefront temple in Palo Alto, is where it was. So she comes in, and she's, just really interested, and she walks in, and there's Jesus on the altar. And it was not a happy moment for her. And then she comes out kind of like this, and she says, I'm Jewish. I said, me too, him, her, like this. But for many months, she would sneak in when there were no activities just to borrow my recordings and never go where the picture of Jesus was. It was just, sort of how she dealt with it. However, sooner or later it has to be looked at. So the issue is twofold. One is sociological. And this is a big problem in India, just by the way, because the Indian people were totally oppressed by the English, and the missionaries just tortured them, insulted them, denigrated them. And so when Ananda and Yogananda when SRF went to India, when Ananda has gone to India, they don't want to hear about Jesus either, for a different reason. I said to Swami, for heaven's sakes, we've had to accept a deathless master who lives up in the Himalayas. I think they can get over this and accept Jesus, But the primary reason is simply this. I grew up neutral on Jesus. I never attached Jesus to anything bad at all. But he was a non-existent reality. In my 20s, at that time, there was no published commentary on the New Testament by Yogananda, but Shivani, another Jew, was determined that we should have these materials, so she got the magazines where they'd been produced, and she Xeroxed them and made them all available for us, which caused us to have an enormous lawsuit 25 years later for copyright infringement, but nonetheless. And then Shivani won it for us by testifying, it was our Bible, and it was denied to us. You would go and get it too, wouldn't you? She persuaded the judge and jury. That's beside the point. So, so I'm in my 20s. I'm reading about the New Testament. I'm reading about Jesus for the first time in any way that I put my heart to it. Everything that Yogananda says about Jesus, it doesn't actually contradict what the churches say in the sense that Jesus was an avatar, Jesus has the power to liberate us. The irony of Christianity is it is the most guru-oriented religion in the world. There is no religion that is so dedicated to the guru as Christianity. And for that reason, it's a great religion. And everything that's there is true, but there's more. There's just more to it. So I was in seclusion, day after day, I'm reading this for the first time. And I had absorbed enough from, the water and the air to have a basically conventional picture of what Yogananda called churchianity, which is not quite the same as what Jesus taught. And I realized fundamentally that nothing I thought about Jesus was true. And so the first question is, who said that? Who told me that there was something contradictory between dedication to Judaism and understanding that Jesus is a great avatar and has a powerful blessing for me? None of that was created by Jesus, and none of that was created by Moses. It was all created afterwards by politics, intellectuality, institutions, money, leadership. So basically, for any of us who were raised with the prejudice, it really doesn't have anything to do with Jesus. It has to do with the simple question, who said that? Why did I believe that was true? Because when Master explains it, which is to say, when Sanatan Dharma explains it. Sanatan Dharma is the Sanskrit word, which is often translated as the eternal religion. But I like a different one, explanation I like, is that which is. Yes, Sanatan Dharma is divine law. And then every so often, one of these great avatars comes with a direct revelation of divine reality, of Sanatan Dharma, of that which is. He explains it to us. When you're in direct relationship with that avatar or with his revelation, then everything is perfectly clear. But then generations pass, politics gets into it, money and power get into it, ego gets into it, or sincerely. People say, one of my friends, there were these two men that were friends of mine for a number of years. They were both Episcopal priests, active Episcopal priests. And we had a lot of fun together. I had enjoyed both of them. And this man, I asked him some question at one point about some aspect of the Bible because he had some advanced degree in his training. And then he says to me like this, well, you know, it's actually understood that the full teaching of Jesus was not really understood for like 300 years until, you know, this happened and that happened. I said, wait a minute. So you're telling me that Jesus himself didn't know what he was talking about, and it took 300 years of scholars to actually figure out what Jesus meant. And my friend just kind of looks at me like this. He says, my life was simpler before I met you. But for a Jewish person to be inhibited to open your heart to Jesus or to respect Jesus, or especially to have to sneak into the temple when the temple's, you know, so you don't have to look, it has nothing to do with Jesus at all. You're just allowing yourself to be hypnotized by subconscious conditioning that has falsely persuaded you that there's a contradiction here. I mean, there was no contradiction when Jesus was alive. There was no such thing as Christianity. You know, they were all Jews. Every one of them was Jews. That's why whenever I tell the Easter story, I do not say that the Jews did it to him, because it wasn't the Jews. It was a corrupt priesthood. You can pin that on any religion throughout history. It was a corrupt priesthood. There were three entities at the time of Jesus: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And Jesus was one of the Essenes. And the Essenes were the ones who still held to the true teaching. The others had become corrupted by, guess what? Power and money. What an odd story. You know, it's the same old story everywhere. I mean, I'm not making this up. This is well understood. And the Essenes were Sanatan Dharma. I mean, I read about the Essenes and I think that was us. You know, that was us at that time. And they tried to bring what they were doing into the mainstream of Judaism, but it would have taken the power and the money and the authority away from the people who had it. Does this sound a little like American politics? Does that? You know, so they had a real message and they took it to the people who wanted to hear it. And then it became something else. When you read, I think it's the letters of Paul, but I'm not educated enough exactly to know, there's this big controversy about whether or not you have to be circumcised in order to be redeemed by Jesus. We read that now and we think, first of all, you think, what about the women? And then the next thing you think is, that is a weird argument, a super weird argument. But the actual question is, would Jesus save you if you were not a Jew? Which is also saying that it was Judaism. But then they were arguing about it. So even from the point of view of what you might call your own faith, our own identity, our own tribe, our own race, it was never there in Jesus. It all was created by all these folk afterwards. So whose side do we want to be on? You know, just simply, whose side do we want to be on this? And it takes a great deal of energy to extricate from your mind things that have been inculcated even from childhood, you know, from just subconscious assumptions. The enemy is ignorance, period. That's just the way it is. The enemy is ignorance. And we have to go back to source. But see, this was Master's mission. He came to teach the original teachings of Jesus. He did not come to teach Christianity. He came to teach the original teachings of Jesus, the original teachings of Krishna. He did not come to teach Hinduism either, because both of those are religions. And the Master brings revelation. Revelation is a direct experience of that which is. Religion is what we do with it afterwards, because we don't have revelation. So if we're sincere, we try to figure it out. You know, what did Jesus really mean? And depending on who you are and how wise you are, you make it up. You know, Shivani is an extremely determined person. And at one point, some Catholic friends of ours gave us some Catholic book, and it like every 4 minutes of your day, there was something specific you were supposed to do. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly. I looked at that book and I said, Shivani wrote this. Because her temperament is so exact. You know, it's like somebody wrote it. It was somebody's good idea about how to get you in tune with this. And then it becomes what you have to do to be in tune. A great deal of difference, you know. So Jesus is wonderful. I mean, I traveled a lot, but only went to Israel in 2015, a short time ago, relatively speaking. And wow, you know, it had nothing to do with anything except Master said, any place that a self-realized being has lived, his vibrations, those vibrations are there forever. And it was just like, and I went 4 times over the next, I think, 3 years, because it was just like, you know, this is something I want to experience. It had nothing to do with anything except me and God. That's all we're working with here. So we have to have the nerve to break out of it. Do we want to be ruled by the past, or do we want to be ruled by the truth? That's what we're looking at. I hope that's helpful, because it's profoundly important. And many, many people who have come to Master's path with Jesus on the altar, who have come from Israel or from Judaism on any form, you know, that you have to figure it out. But you have to figure it out, and it just has more to do with subconscious conditioning than it has to do with anything to do with these masters. However, when my parents came to visit me, I just took the picture of Jesus down. It wasn't worth it.
And if I can just give a little bit of a perspective, and I'm not Jewish, and I don't pretend to understand exactly what it's like to be Jewish and to wrestle with Jesus, but let me kind of give you somewhat of a parallel. So being raised very Catholic and very Christian, and it wasn't a bad experience for me. I had a very powerful spiritual awakening centered around Jesus when I was 16, but I grew up in a context where you really believed that Jesus was the only divine incarnation. And if you were really kind of stuck in this way, that Jesus was the only way to God. I never quite bought that, but I was okay with all of the Kriya gurus except Babaji. Because he's Babaji. I mean, he's indescribable. He's the avatar's avatar. I don't know how else to say it. And there was a part of me that's like, wait a minute.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And I wrestled with that, like, wait a minute. Is this true? Can it be true? Maybe it's a myth. I went through all kinds of machinations. And I'm not saying it's the same thing, but you used an analogy the other day. We were meeting, I think it was with the teachers. And and I loved the visual. You said we start out in the egoic consciousness, and then it spreads and it spreads and it spreads, and pretty soon it becomes super consciousness, and that can go on and spreading and widening for all of eternity. And I realized I was at this point I'm just trying to say it's a very loose parallel, but I was at this point, okay, if what they're saying about Babaji is true, my paradigm is going to get wider.
Yeah.
And it's going to get a lot wider. And I wanted it to get wider, but was I still a good Catholic? And I still am. Well, if you go on a site, Catholic Heretics, my name is actually on it. It's true. It's true. But I still consider myself a Catholic, but I'm more than a Catholic.
That's exactly right.
Larger.
Yeah.
So I can still integrate my Catholicism into my largeness through my own heretic lens.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just this moment with Babaji that I finally just said, I trust Yogananda with every fiber of my being. I truly do. And if he says Babaji is real, I remember I just said, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And I've shared some of this, and I won't get into the detail. When I went to India in February, I believe I had a profound moment with Babaji. Mm-hmm. Profound. He told me our work at the Assisi Institute was blessed. So I didn't lose Jesus. My heart and my mind just got bigger, but I had to get over my own hurdles because of my own cultural and theological conditioning. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it made me wider.
That's exactly.
But I had to die to the ego that was buying into everything else and found a degree of false security in the old dogmas.
Yeah. Very well done.
So I have foster parents that I went to live with when I was 16. They're very Catholic. In fact, he's an ordained deacon in a Catholic church. So if you see them, please don't tell them I said any of this. It's like you with the picture of Jesus. I don't talk about reincarnation. They're just glad that I married Vicky and that I'm happy, and they think I'm, a really good Catholic boy.
Very good. I'm going to tell you a couple. I did remember what I was going to say, and this is actually extraordinarily relevant. The Bible, is silent after Jesus turns 13 until he's 30. There's whatever those 18 years in there, 17, 18 years. Nowadays, it's not even a secret. Everybody talks about it, that Jesus went to India. Yogananda said it right from the beginning. The 3 wise men were the 3 gurus who came over, and then Jesus returned the visit. There's many, many, many documents now these days and stories. I said to Swamiji at one point, "Sir, Jesus' real mission was in India. He was only in the West for 3 years. He spent the majority of his teaching life in India. And he was well known and well respected, and they recognized him for exactly what it is." And there's whole schools of things that just integrate the teachings of Jesus right into Sanatana Dharma, which is just one more reason why the whole thing about Judaism is just distorted. He was a universal teacher, and as I said, he spent most of his time somewhere else, and it's just not. It's not at all what was happening. Let's see. You were talking about. Now the second thought I had was lost. I had 2, but that's the only one I could remember. But I really wanted to get that one into your minds. It's fascinating when you read it. There's a number of books that you can read about the lost years of Jesus. And they're well worth reading because it just gives you a closer understanding of what the reality really was of his time. Yeah.
I want to share a quick story that backs that up.
You don't
This
have to
was-
be quick.
This was, maybe 20 years ago. I had a conversation with a Catholic nun who was a Jyotish astrologer. And I said to her, "Okay, you're a Catholic nun, you're still in the church, right?" "Yep." "How did you become, tell me how you bring these 2 worlds together." And she said, "Well, I struggled with it because, in technical teachings of the Catholic Church, astrology is verboten. It's not that you're not supposed to do it." So then she told me how she became peaceful with it. And I got to give you this backdrop. So there's this Italian American, I think he was in the Peace Corps, he was in India. And it was hot summer, as he tells the story, he was sitting under a tree. It was so hot. He said, what am I doing in this God-forsaken land with all these pagans? That was what he was saying to himself. And this orange-clad yogi, Swami, came by and said, follow me, I'm going to take you where it's cool. So he's telling the story, he's walking through the woods. He said, I'm crazy, he's going to hit me over the head and take my wallet and whatever I have. Well, they found this monastery, but most of the monastery was subterranean. It was built under the earth. So he said, come on in, and it's cool, because it was underground. So he said it was really cool. And then the Swami said, but there's another reason why you're here, and I'm going to go meditate and find out what it is. Again, the Catholic nun is telling me this story. So the guy's looking around, and there's statues. And he sees the statue of Jesus. He said, what's he doing with all these pagans? You know, it was his mindset. And then the Swami came back, I know why you're here. That picture, that statue you're looking at is Jesus. He was here during the lost years.
Yeah.
And God wants you to go across the big pond and find this Catholic nun and tell her this story.
Really kind of.
So she said, this guy knocked on her door one day and said, are you the Jyotish astrologer? She said, yes, I have to tell you this story.
Oh my gosh.
And she said after that story, she was okay with being a Jyotish astrologer.
What a funny world.
That's a true story. She
No,
told me herself.
You see how big the world is and how
Yeah.
small our imaginations are? When you said that about you're still a Catholic, it's just the Catholic. That's how I feel also about being Jewish.
Yeah.
Actually, it surprises me how often I mention it. Oh, I know. The other thing I was going to tell you, just about your foster mother. Okay. I mean, it reminded me. My parents, because they raised me to think for myself, I thought for myself, so I found a new way of living. And they over the years, they alternately supported it. For a very brief period of time, they tried to oppose it. I said to my father, don't make me choose. If you make me choose, I will not choose you. I said, don't do this. And then they never touched it again. But everything was fine until the mid-'80s when Swami Kriyananda wrote an oratorio. He went on pilgrimage to Israel, and then he came and wrote this beautiful oratorio with all these songs about Jesus. So somehow my parents would sort of keep track of what was going on, not just because they were like that. And so they suddenly found out that I was a Christian, and they'd never actually picked that up until then. They tried to tell me I had just become a Christian. I expressed to them that I always had, they just didn't know it. But it was really, I had crossed the line like this. So then my mother, I think I think Catholic mothers are not dissimilar to Jewish mothers. At some point, my mother and I were having this conversation, and she starts saying, because I was not raised, we were not observant, we were secular. And my mother said, if only we had raised you in Judaism, then this wouldn't have happened. I said, Mother, it's really just fine. You know, you were wonderful parents. There's no problem. Oh, if only we had raised you in Judaism, this wouldn't have happened. She did it 3 times. I refuted it 3 times. And then this little voice said, let her take responsibility. So instead I said, yes, Mother, things might have been so different. And we lamented together about what might have been. It never came up again. They were perfectly
I was raised.
okay.
I was bar mitzvah.
Well, I'm going to tell you a funny story with my foster parents. Again, they're very Catholic, and they were very disappointed when Vicki and I did not get married in the Catholic Church.
yeah.
Very disappointed. Didn't make a difference. We got married in Assisi, Italy, by a Swami. They were very disappointed. So after we were married, I didn't hear from them for like 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And my foster father's a straight shooter. Like if he was a vice president at Xerox, if he'd been in the military, he would have been a 5-star general. He just has that.
Mm-hmm.
So I could be very straight with him. So I called him up. I said, so have you disowned me? And they said, no, but we don't know what to think. So I said, okay, Vicki and I are going to come out. They have a cottage on Soders Bay here. It's about an hour from here. And it was funny because I felt like I was gay and coming out to them. So we sat down and I said, I know you don't understand, but I want you to try to understand. And I told them about the yoga and what it had changed my life. And I felt like I had a calling to do this. And I was still Catholic, just not exactly in the way that they were. And they were very sweet. They said, well, we know you're so happy with Vicki and she is so good to you. And we've never seen you better.
Yeah, right.
So, okay.
Yeah, so, okay.
So we've been at peace with it.
Yeah.
It was a little bit scary going to talk, because, you know, I'm in their will. I didn't want to be kicked out of it, you know. Well, my mother didn't raise a dumb son.
But when I was being harassed once, I actually think I was in Houston, Texas at the time. I was being harassed for abandoning my tradition. Even like, why did I look to the east and move from the west? And I'm good at being heckled. I'm not intimidated. So whoever was heckling me, I said, you're telling me that I abandoned my tradition. I did not. I have not. I've just come to a deeper, bigger understanding in which it is still as vibrant and real as it has ever been. And fundamental part of me, I've just made a bigger picture out of it. And that's really the right answer, which is, don't tell me who I am. I'm going to tell you who I am. And I'm going to tell you from my heart. Right, that's what we have to do.
I was telling just you maybe yesterday, occasionally I get letters from fundamental Christians or Catholics who say that I am somehow limiting Jesus, dishonoring Jesus. And I always come back and say, no, you are. And they say, well, why do you say that? I said, because you limit where Jesus and the Christ consciousness can work. And it can only work in your church, your way. Jesus and the Christ consciousness is universal and can show up anywhere. I'm not going to tell Jesus and the Christ consciousness where it can show up or not show up, and neither can you.
Yeah.
They never know what to say to that.
You know, the other side of this, just to be fair, I mean, I'm not usually the one who's on this side, but I'm going to say it this way. We have to be sincere to what works for us. And it's not good karma to undermine someone's faith at any time at all. We find what the way in which, and this is what you're saying, the way in which God will speak to us. I was on a television show, not a radio interview, and I had been invited there to talk about organic gardening and goats because we were back to the land. But before it started, it turns out that this man who was interviewing me had been a drug addict, and he had been saved by Jesus Christ. And he clung to that Savior. And hallelujah, praise the Lord, he had been saved. And somehow he found out about all of this. He didn't really know. I'd been invited on for a different context, country living, all of this. But he felt obligated, for some reason, to challenge my spirituality. So which put me in a very unusual position, because I was not going to say anything that would in any way diminish that man's commitment. It would have been a sin for me to do that. And so he kept trying to engage me. And I finally said, something like, I don't know how I put it, but I said, I don't think that's what we're going to talk about. This is a live radio interview. I just went silent. And we just had to sit there for a while because I wasn't going to break the silence until we just went back. He saw that we weren't going to go anywhere. I wouldn't have touched that. I was in a coffee shop once, and there was a woman there it was summer, and she was in a tank top, and her back was exposed. And she was sitting there reading a Bible, a very well-studied Bible, like people develop, with lots of notes and lots of things in it, and she was studying it. And across her back, she had tattooed in big letters, it said, It said redeemed. And I thought to myself, my God, what a journey this woman must have had to have come to the point where she could be reading that Bible and had the mark of Christ on her back. And I just, I wanted to touch her feet in gratitude, to see something like that. That's all that matters. God doesn't care what we call it. And he doesn't really care how we act it out. You just find what holds your heart and then just hold on to it and try to get bigger in the ways that matter. The philosophy doesn't matter a whit. It's really who we are. Okay.
The last thing I'll just say is I think it's in the spirit of what you're saying. It's a quote allegedly from Babaji. It's a perfect quote. He said, if you meditate 13 hours a day for 13 years and you have no compassion, your meditation is a waste of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Compassion for everybody, everything, including ourselves.
Right. I think that sounded like the closing line.
I think so, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Asha. And again, thank you all for coming. And we'll close with Yogananda's prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, saints and sages of all religions,
Saints and sages of all religions,
may thy love shine forever
may thy love shine forever
on the sanctuary of our devotion,
on the sanctuary of our devotion,
and may we be able to awaken thy love in all hearts.
and may we be able to awaken thy love in all hearts.
Om
Om
Shanti, 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 Shalom. Amen.